Namaste. As of 2024, over 700 million individuals globally survive on less than $1.90 per day. The Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, were 8 goals established by the United Nations in 2000 to reduce poverty, hunger, disease, and gender inequality, and improve access to education, water, sanitation, and environmental sustainability. The MDGs were targeted to be achieved by 2015. While the MDGs have been successful in reducing poverty and improving access to education, they have fallen short in halving the proportion of people suffering from hunger was narrowly missed. Achieving universal primary education was just missed, with the net enrollment rate increasing from 83% in 2000 to 91% in 2015. However, the number of people living on less than 125 a day has been reduced from 1.9 billion in 1990 to 836 million in 2015. The global maternal mortality ratio has fallen by nearly half, but it has failed to meet the MDG target of 2/3 reduction. The target of halting and beginning to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS by 2015 has not been met. Although the number of new HIV infections fell by around 40% between 2000 and 2013. The Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, replaced the MDGs in 2016. The SDGs are a set of 17 goals that aim to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. At the midpoint of 2030 agenda, all of the SDGs were seriously off track. UN's midterm assessment. The SDG midterm review was conducted in July 2022 and critically analyzed to identify and understand the root cause for challenges faced by member countries while sharing the outcome of the analysis, recommending actions to accelerate the pace of implementation to achieve the agreed target. Lessons learned. Actions suggested. The midterm review strongly suggested governments renew their commitment to achieving the SDG targets with the resources required, revitalize policy and practice based on learning, improved accountability, capacity and institutional delivery mechanisms, and collectively address challenges faced by the more vulnerable countries. Progress. Irrespective of the laudable outcomes the SDG aims to achieve by 2030, the midterm review indicates that every one of the 193 member countries faces challenges when implementing this multifaceted program, with only 15% of the countries on track, while 48% moderately or severely off track, and 37% stagnant or regress. 5 major conclusions from this comprehensive assessment of policy efforts and commitment to the SDGs are: first, government efforts and commitment to the SDGs remain far too low. The average score of the 74 countries assessed is 56%, with none even close to obtaining a perfect score. Second, there are major differences across countries. 4 European countries stand out as being very committed to the SDGs: Finland, Netherlands, Sweden, and Switzerland. But scores among the G20 countries range from 77% in Indonesia to less than 40% in the Russian Federation and the United States. Third, of the 3 pillars, scores are on average lowest for the second one, related to adopting and implementing SDG policies and pathways. This is driven in part by the moderate or low performance of LICs and LMICs on this pillar. That's low-income countries and low and medium-income countries, as these countries may lack the financial resources needed to successfully adopt and implement SDG investments and pathways. The high-income countries' somewhat better performance on Pillar 2 is largely due to their strong performance on the education, health, and digital scorecards. More ambitious policies and actions on climate and decarbonization are needed. Fourth, LICs and LMICs score more highly on political leadership and institutional leadership for the SDGs than the high-income countries. Fifth, all countries can do more to promote multilateralism in line with the United Nations Charter. Summary update. The goal and targets covered in this presentation are: Goal 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Having targets 1.1 by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. 1.2, by 2030, reduce at least half the population of men, women, and children of all ages living in poverty in all its dimensions according to national definitions. According to the review, if current trends continue, 575 million people will still be living in extreme poverty, and only 1/3 of countries will have halved their national poverty levels by 2030. Despite the expansion of social protection during the COVID-19 crisis, over 4 billion people remain entirely unprotected. Many of the world's vulnerable population groups, including the young and the elderly, remain uncovered by statutory social protection programs. The share of government spending on essential services such as education, health, and social protection is significantly higher in advanced economies than in emerging and developing countries. A surge in action and investment to enhance economic opportunities, improve education, and extend social protection to all, particularly the most excluded, is crucial to delivering on the central commitment to end poverty and leave no one behind. Of the few essentials required to include the poor and excluded population into the mainstream is good governance. The sample countries used for the presentation are the economically poorest, with over 50% of their populations rated as below the poverty line. The country's inability to address its people's expectations is also reaffirmed by the governance ratings, which indicate their inability to control corruption, have ineffective governments, are politically unstable and affected by terrorism, have little or no regulations, ineffective judiciary and weak institutions, and have very low or insignificant people's participation in governance. In addition to being weak governments, a large poor population living at the subsistence level are also affected by the large population who do not have access to basic services. High multi-dimensional poverty. Poverty and illiteracy tend to go together. Education and other essential services like health care and access to nutritious foods is also often less available in poverty-stricken areas. Moreover, even when education is available, a struggling family might need their children to work and earn money instead of going to school. Most of the countries with the lowest literacy are the poorest countries in the world. There is also a gender gap in literacy. Of the roughly 781 million adults worldwide who cannot read or write, nearly 2/3 are female. This disparity is particularly noticeable in less developed countries, in which women are often expected to stay at home and care for the house and children while the men go off to work. The developed nations of the world have much higher literacy rates with smaller gaps, if any, between the genders. There appears to be a visible relationship between the population in poverty and the population engaged in agriculture. The sample countries have 50% or higher populations below the poverty line, with most of whom are most probably engaged in agriculture. The per capita GDP is extremely low because most agriculture in these countries continues to retain traditional methods, which are low or no investment production systems, resulting in low yields, thus dubbed subsistence. Subsistence agriculture barely produces enough to feed the farm family, which is reflected in the per capita GDP, which is so low that one cannot even begin to imagine how those below the poverty line families even survive in the current unstable global conditions. The nation's debt to GDP ratio indicates the additional pressure on poor countries to first pay their national debt instead of investing in creating a sustainable profit-making economy. The nation's debt to GDP ratio indicates the additional pressure on poor countries to first pay their national debt instead of investing in creating a sustainable profit-making economy. It is just not enough to waive the national debt of LICs when they are deficient in finances required to create the wealth to emerge from the poverty trap. Summary update. Decent work and economic growth. Multiple crises are placing the global economy under serious threat. Global real GDP per capita growth is forecast to slow down in 2023. Challenging economic conditions are pushing more workers into informal employment. As economies start to recover, the global unemployment rate has experienced a significant decline. However, the youth unemployment rate continues to be much higher than the rate for adults, indicating ongoing challenges in securing employment opportunities for young people. The pandemic has accelerated digital adoption and transformed access to finance. Globally, 76% of adults had bank accounts or accounts with regulated institutions in 2021, up from 62% in 2014. Achieving Goal 8 will require a wholesale reform of the financial system to tackle rising debts, economic uncertainty, and trade tensions while promoting equitable pay and decent work for young people. The goal and targets covered in this presentation are: Goal 8, promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. 8.2, achieve higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation, including through a focus on high value-added and labor-intensive sectors. The employment to population ratio worldwide was estimated to be approximately 56% in 2023, indicating that just over half the global population above 15 years was employed. Poverty and economic growth. Poverty is a condition in which one lacks the financial resources to maintain a certain standard of living. It is said to exist when people lack the means to satisfy their basic needs. The identification of poor people first requires a determination of what constitutes basic needs, which may be defined as narrowly as those necessary for survival, or as broadly as those reflecting the prevailing standard of living in the community. The problem of definition is further compounded by the non-economic connotations that the word poverty has acquired. Poverty has been associated, for example, with poor health, low levels of education or skills, and inability or an unwillingness to work, high rates of disruption or disorderly behavior, and improvidence. Although poverty is a phenomenon as old as human history, its significance has changed over time. Under traditional, that is non-industrialized modes of economic production, widespread poverty has been accepted as inevitable. The total output of goods and services, even if equally distributed, would still have been insufficient to give the entire population a comfortable standard of living by prevailing standards. To get an idea of the strengths of an economy, one needs to understand the sources that contribute to the gross domestic product. In most countries across the globe, the three most important sectors which contribute to the GDP are agriculture, industry, and the service sector. In countries with a high ratio of population below the poverty line, like in the sample shown below, agriculture and animal husbandry, once traditional occupations, now demand investments towards seeds, fertilizers, field preparation, irrigation, animal feed, and veterinarian services, which increasingly require high investments to stay competitive. Making such investments by the farming communities that are struggling to make ends meet is not their priority. Thus, the contribution of agriculture towards the GDP is declining. The share of industry in the GDP baskets is higher than agriculture. This sector offers the poor with employment. However, its growth is constrained by the limited investment the country may have. The service sector contributes the most to the GDP basket and also employs a vast number of skilled and unskilled workers. The employment to population ratio worldwide was estimated to be approximately 56% in 2023, indicating that just over half of the global population above 15 years was employed. Poverty is a condition in which one lacks the financial resources to maintain a certain standard of living. It is said to exist when people lack the means to satisfy their basic needs. The agriculture, industry, and service sectors absorb most of the population, although globally, 26% are employed in the agriculture sector. About multidimensional poverty. Social protection provides a secure platform upon which individuals can build productive and sustainable livelihoods, directly reduces poverty and vulnerability, as well as supporting excluded citizens in accessing other services. The objective of social protection vary widely, from reducing poverty and vulnerability, building human capital, empowering women and girls, improving livelihoods, and responding to economic and other shocks. The process to identify the extent to which interventions are required to provide social protection to vulnerable families is assessed by the multidimensional assessment method. Having used and found less effective to estimate and target the population below the poverty line, the one-dimensional per capita daily income measure does not account for most indicators that better reflect productivity, which is now included in the multidimensional poverty measure. The Leave No One Behind MDP rating. The Leave No One Behind HDI ranges from 0 to 1, with 1 being the highest possible value that indicates a country has made progress in reducing inequality and ensuring that all members of society have access to the resources and opportunities they need to achieve their full potential. Conversely, a lower LB-HDI score indicates that a country has not made sufficient progress in reducing inequality and that some members of society are being left behind. There is no specific threshold for a good LB-HDI score, as it depends on the context of the evaluated country. However, countries with higher LB-HDI scores tend to have more equitable distribution of resources and opportunities, which can lead to greater social cohesion and stability. According to the World Population Review, Switzerland and Norway have the highest HDI scores, which are seen to be closely related to LB-HDI scores. Country status. Countries with the highest prevalence of multidimensional poverty. Countries rated at 0.5 need to invest in making available and accessible the essential services required by the population. Regionally, the monetary headcount, which is based on the international poverty line of $2.15 per day, shows sub-Saharan Africa is ranked first with around 32% of the population below the poverty line, followed by South Asia at 8% and Latin America and the Caribbean at 4%. The multidimensional poverty measure, headcount, indicates the share of the population in each region defined as multidimensionally poor and is topped by sub-Saharan Africa at 52% and South Asia at 17%. The MDP rating, when assessed for locations within regions, will provide a more accurate view of the level of multidimensional poverty and a better indication of the challenges to sustainable growth and increasing productivity. Of the 121 economies reviewed by the World Bank, 54 countries fall into the high multidimensional poverty rating. In conclusion, the MDGs were replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals in 2016, which are a set of 17 goals that aim to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure prosperity for all. The Millennium Development Goals were a set of time-bound targets that have led to profound achievements, including reducing extreme poverty over the last 25 years by more than 50%, tripled the number of people living on more than $4 a day. 2.6 billion people have gained access to improved drinking water. However, at the midpoint of the 2030 agenda, all the SDGs are seriously off track. As previously indicated, the data and information used to illustrate the reticence or inability of member countries to address the challenges of lifting and retaining their populations through poverty removal was retrieved from public sources. I do thank all the sources for allowing the use of their information and hope that the idea and practice of information freedom and transparency continues to be safeguarded. The information helped categorically lay out the link between poverty, insufficient investment capacity, and the lack of government accountability to its electorate. Unfortunately, the country examples used as illustrations in the arguments are the most vulnerable countries across the globe and suffer from much the same challenges which, when left on their own, prevent them from making any significant, sustainable, and long-term changes to processes that could have positive impacts on their economies. The information shared by the various global and country organizations clearly prioritizes poverty as the primary challenge for the global population, irrespective of the region or country, and loudly reiterates the root causes of poverty while suggesting a multi-dimensional approach for its removal. So what's the catch? The discussion in the next presentation will dive deep into the SDG on poverty to determine whether poverty is being used as a tool to undercut a nation's ability to effectively build the self-reliance required for them to create productive sectors that significantly contribute to establishing a growing economy, and the effects of wealth imbalance on global peace and security.